Okay, so this is where I am in the build process. I've basically gotten up to the point where I assemble the shocks. So this is the bag with all the shocks in it. I'll get to that next. The rear gearbox is all built, the drivetrain's built, all the turnbuckles are assembled. So I want to make a few comments here before I get to the shocks and the rest of the build, and I'll surely make another few videos after this. Starting with the front, there was one thing I forgot to mention about the front, and that is the front inner hinge pin mount, this little block right here. This mounts into the front bulkhead using two 2.5 millimeter screws. Okay, they're rather similar in size to those tiny screws that you use on the B4 chassis, these guys right here and here. Okay, now a problem I had with these screws on the B4 chassis, these are 0.05 inch hex heads that you put in here, is that when you break an arm, you have to pull this out to get the hinge pin out and replace the arm. Now that's normally not a big deal, but the problem is because these hex heads are small, if you are not a very good driver, you end up breaking arms a lot, you're going to have to pull this out a lot and those hex heads will strip. I am a little concerned about the same thing here. Now instead of a 0.05 inch screw head that you use here, because it's a 2.5 millimeter screw, you use a 1.5 millimeter hex head. So this I think is a little bit bigger than this screw, but it's still relatively small. And it would have been nice if instead of using the 2.5 millimeter screws, they used a conventional 3 millimeter screw, so that this would not only hold better, but it would also be a little bit more robust if you have to pull this out to replace an arm. So it's a minor complaint, but it's one I feel I need to make here. On the rear here, the assembly was very much like a B4 in terms of how the gearbox went together, how the gearbox mounts onto the chassis through these two holes here for the wing mounts and the rear shock tower. There are two holes here that mount the gearbox onto the rear U-brace, and there are also two holes on the bottom that mount the rear motor mount through the chassis into the rear gearbox. So exactly the same as the B4 in that regard, but when you put the gearbox together, all these screws that go on the side here, they do not screw through the motor plate. They just screw into the gearbox to hold the gearbox together, and the motor plate screws into the gearbox from 3 screws on this side. So that means when you take this apart and you take this half of the gearbox out, when you remove all these screws, you can keep the motor plate fixed here, and this doesn't fall off. So that's kind of convenient. I do have to say that once you get used to working on the B4 gearbox, it's really not a big deal with that motor plate sort of flopping around when you remove the screws from this side. But nevertheless, it does make things a little bit easier. The ball diff itself is a little chunkier than on the B4. Just give me a second here. So let me go back through that. Here. So what's nice is as part of the kit, they give you carbide diff balls for the main diff balls here, 332 inch, just like for the B4. But instead of using 12 diff balls, you use 14. I believe the B4 came stock with steel diff balls, so the fact that you had carbide here is nice. So that's a nice little feature there. These diff halves are symmetric. On the B4, you had a left and a right half. So this is a nice little touch so that you basically, from Team Associated side, it makes it less expensive for them to manufacture the diff outdrives, because both sides are the same side. Moving over here to the thrust bearing assembly, on the B4, the thrust balls were, I think they were a 1/16 inch thrust ball. On the B5, they are notably larger in diameter. They're 5/64 inch, and you use 6 of them. So, but however, these are not carbide, these are steel, and you have to be careful not to over tighten the diff screw down. You might start to flatten these out. I am afraid I may have done that myself when I was trying to figure out exactly what is fully locked on the diff. When you build a fresh, brand new diff with a brand new thrust-bearing spring, sometimes it's a little difficult to gauge exactly how much is fully locked on the thrust bolt before you start compressing or damaging these thrust balls. So the diff is smooth, but I feel some slight, how do I put it? I don't want to say chunky, but there are some sort of notches in there. And maybe because I may have started to flatten these thrust balls a little bit. I'm not too concerned about that, though. It's still perfectly fine. So the diff went together okay. Gearbox went together fine. No real complaints there. It's basically a stealth gearbox, just like the B4, except using metric parts. The idler gear that goes in the middle here, I think it's a larger gear. It has more teeth than the old B4 idler gear. So this should help the idler last longer. I think I ended up stripping one of my idler gears once, and I have friends who've stripped their idlers on their B4 or T4 chassis. So this should hold together a little more nicely than the B4 Stealth. Mounting is no big deal there. The VTS slipper clutch. This is the first VTS slipper that I have ever assembled because on the B4 it's just a standard version 2 slipper clutch. And with the VTS, what you have is actually a conventional slipper pad on the backside, and then there's this sort of plastic assembly right here. Okay, so on the other side of the spur is your conventional slipper pad, and then on this side, this plastic assembly slots into the part of the spur gear where you would have otherwise put a conventional octagonal slipper pad. And then in here, you mount these two little slipper pads here. Okay, that's this and this. There's a metal plate that goes between them, and then there's this metal plate on this side, and they all sort of lock into place. Okay, so this went together okay. I would say that the metal plate here has little notches on the inside to help it align to this guy, I think, and that all has to go into this plastic assembly. And the plastic assembly goes into the spur gear. Now, this assembly, it did feel like there was a little bit of maybe warpage or something. It didn't mount or slot in perfectly into the spur gear. So I tried to sort of kind of snap it in there, and when I snap in, say, one side, then the other side would pull up or something. So the fit and finish of the VTS slipper is not really any better than the standard version 2 slipper you get on the B4. But it's not bad. I mean, you just have to, this is probably the first part of the build where I really had to fiddle around a little bit just to make sure everything was fitting correctly before tightening down the lock nut for the slipper. But it works fine now, although I will say that there is a little bit of wobbling here. Maybe it's hard to see, but you notice as I rotate this, the spur is kind of moving in and out this way. Okay, I actually have that same kind of behavior on my B4. It shouldn't be an issue so long as there's no wobbling this way, right? So radially, the spur gear is fairly uniform, although it's maybe hard to see here. So this will not affect the gear mesh. Just means that the spur might slide along a little bit on the pinion as it's rotating. But otherwise, it's fine. The rear hub carriers assembled very nicely. There are some inserts for, let me move ahead a page here. This guy right here. Okay. So there's an insert that you put into the bottom of the rear hub carrier, and that's for extra toe-in. So you use a 0-degree insert as stock, and there's a 1-degree insert that you could add. So if you remember, there's a 3+2 block on the inside here for the inner hinge pin. So that gives you 3 degrees of rear toe-in and 2 degrees of anti-squat. And then here you have 0 degrees extra toe-in. If you want, you could put in 1 degree if you like. Now, there is a difference between adding rear toe-in on the rear hub carrier and adding it on the inner block here. Okay, So if you add it on the rear hub carrier, say I just take this hub carrier and imaginarily sort of move it around like this, right, to change the rear toe. What's happening is, as I'm changing that toe in, the amount by which the dog bone plunges into the diff outdrive is exactly the same, because I'm just really just rotating around the CVA joint, okay? But if I change the rear toe on the inside here, I'm moving the position of the arm itself. So if I add rear toe in with the block, I'm pulling the dog bone out a little bit, so I get less what's called dog bone plunge. Now, dog bone plunge impacts how much rear traction you have. When the dog bone is sliding in and out of the outdrive as the suspension is compressing under acceleration, it's grabbing against the diff outdrive, and that creates friction. The motor has to fight against that, and as a result, you get less power transfer to the rear wheels, which means you get more rear traction. It's harder to break traction. Okay? So that's what dog bone plunge does, and you don't change that at all if you change your rear toe in with the hub carrier, but you do change it if you change it in here, okay, with the inner block. And again, with the inner block, there are a few options for that they give you for toe in and anti-squat. I described anti-squat a little bit in one of the previous videos. I just want to try to, I guess, help clarify a bit. As I mentioned before, if you have more anti-squat, the angle of the suspension arm is a little sharper. So vertically, the suspension is effectively stiffer, okay? So one of the things that does is it results in the rear squatting less under acceleration. That's why it's called anti-squat. If the rear squats less, then there's less suspension travel, which means for a given amount of camber gain, there's less change in camber dynamically as the car is accelerating. And that maintains more contact patch of the rear tire relative to the ground. So that's one reason why you get more traction with more anti-squat. Another reason is because, again, since the suspension's stiffer, the weight is pressing more against the tire and not being absorbed as much into the suspension, and that extra pressure generates friction, which generates grip. Okay. Now you can run into a problem where if the track surface is low traction, you put too much pressure on, you're going to break traction and the car's going to slide around. So too much anti-squat and or too stiff of a suspension will actually make the car looser under acceleration rather than more stable. Okay. So I just want to help clarify that there. The actual CVD joints are pretty nice. They are, how do I say, they're nested inside the inner bearing of the rear hub carrier. So the part where you mount the drive pin here that goes in the middle of the joint, this isn't locked in with like a grub screw or anything. This whole unit is basically encased inside the inner bearing here. So very much like an RC10 4x4, if you have one of those, that's how it locks in. Now I had noticed on the RC10 4x4, on occasion, if this wheel hex gets loose, then you get a little bit of play, and this wheel axle can push out a bit, and it'll push out just enough for this hinge pin to pop out, because this is held in place by the bearing. So you got to make sure that this wheel hex is securely in place. Now the wheel hex that you get with the kit is just a plastic wheel hex, and it just slides right in. Make sure you slide it in enough so that it locks in place nice and firm. I would not be surprised if we see in the future some aluminum wheel hexes with a grub screw that are offered as an aftermarket option that'll help lock this in place. For now, I'm going to use the plastic unit that comes with the kit. Let's see what else here. The ball stud mount here is you get your standard 3 holes as options, and there's an aluminum insert on the back and a plastic insert on the front, and they go they go together as a unit. And if you want to use the B-type tower, this is the A tower. If you want to use the B tower, you pull these out, put in the B tower inserts, different plastic insert in the front, different aluminum insert in the rear, and you're good to go. So let's see. I think that's all I had to say about this for now. And I'm going to get to the shocks. And if there's anything I have to say about this, I'm sure I will have to say something about it in another video. So thanks for watching.